Zektar stood before the massive viewing window of the transport ship, watching the blue and green world grow larger as they approached. His 6 arms moved with practiced precision as he checked his equipment one final time. The energy rifle felt familiar in his primary hands while his secondary arms adjusted the tactical display on his armor. After 300 cycles of military service, he had fought alongside dozens of species across the galaxy, but these humans would be different. The Galactic Federation had discovered Earth only 2 solar cycles ago, and already the High Command wanted these newcomers in active combat operations. Zektar did not understand the logic behind this decision. The humans possessed primitive technology compared to most Federation worlds, and their physical capabilities seemed limited. They were smaller than his own Cytherian people and lacked the natural armor plating that made his species such effective warriors. The transport ship shuddered as it entered the atmosphere of the colony world, designated New Boston. Through his tactical display, Zektar could see the human military installation spread across several square kilometers of cleared forest. The buildings looked simple and functional, lacking the elegant curves and crystal spires that marked advanced Federation architecture. Everything about this place suggested a young species that had barely learned to travel between stars. When the transport touched down, Zektar gathered his gear and walked down the ramp. The gravity here felt slightly heavier than standard Federation. Norm and the air carried unfamiliar scents of growing things and combustion engines. A group of humans waited near the landing pad, their uniforms marked with colorful patches and symbols that meant nothing to the Cytherian warrior. The human who stepped forward was clearly their leader. He stood shorter than Zektar by nearly a full meter, but carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to command. His hair had turned gray at the temples, and his face bore the lines that came from making difficult decisions. When he spoke, his voice carried an authority that transcended species barriers. "Welcome to New Boston, Commander Zektar," the human said, extending his hand in what Zektar recognized as their greeting gesture. "I'm Colonel Jake Morrison, commanding officer of the 3rd Marine Expeditionary Unit." Zektar carefully took the offered hand with one of his primary arms, noting the surprising strength in the human's grip. "Colonel Morrison, I am honored to serve alongside your forces in this operation." A younger human stepped up beside the colonel. She appeared to be female of their species, with short brown hair and eyes that seemed to constantly evaluate everything around her. Her uniform bore the markings of a junior officer, but she moved with the same confident bearing as her commander. "This is Lieutenant Lisa Carter, my tactical officer," Morrison said. "She'll be your primary liaison during the operation." Lieutenant Carter nodded respectfully. "We've prepared quarters for you in the main barracks, Commander. If you'd like, we can begin the mission briefing immediately." As they walked toward the base, Zektar observed the human soldiers going about their duties. They seemed remarkably casual compared to Federation military standards. Groups of them laughed and talked while performing maintenance on their vehicles. Others played some kind of sport involving a spherical object in an open area between buildings. The entire atmosphere felt more like a gathering of friends than a military installation. "Your soldiers appear very relaxed," Zektar commented to Colonel Morrison. The human smiled, an expression that Zektar had learned indicated amusement rather than aggression. "They're good troops, Commander. They know when to be serious and when to blow off steam. You'll see the difference when we get into combat." The briefing room was a simple space with basic holographic displays showing star charts and tactical information. Other Federation officers were already present, including 2 Velthari scouts and a Gornaxian heavy weapons specialist that Zektar recognized from previous campaigns. The mixed unit represented standard Federation doctrine for joint operations. "Lieutenant." Carter activated the central display, showing a 3-dimensional map of their target. "The Vexani Empire has established a forward operating base on Kepler 442b, she began. "Intelligence indicates they're using it as a staging area for raids against Federation supply convoys. Zektar studied the tactical situation with professional interest. The Vexani were known for their aggressive expansion policies and advanced shielding technology. They typically built heavily fortified positions that required significant firepower to overcome. This would be a challenging operation, but well within the capabilities of a mixed Federation force. Our objective is to eliminate the Vexani presence and secure the mining facilities, Colonel Morrison continued. We'll be going in with a combined force of Federation heavy assault units, my Marines, and support elements from the 7th Fleet. The tactical breakdown seemed straightforward enough to Zektar. His own people would provide the main assault force while the humans handled perimeter security and logistics support. It appeared to be a standard assignment that would allow him to evaluate human capabilities without placing too much responsibility on the untested species. What Zektar did not yet understand was that nothing involving humans could ever be truly standard. The next morning brought Zektar his first real exposure to human military training methods. He had risen early according to his species' natural cycle and found the base already bustling with activity. Humans seemed to require less rest than most Federation species, and many of them had been awake for hours before the official start of their duty day. Captain Ryan Brooks led the morning combat drills in a large training area behind the main barracks. Zektar watched from an observation platform as the human soldiers practiced what they called close-quarters combat. Unlike the precise formations and calculated movements that marked Catherian military exercises, the humans seemed to embrace chaos and unpredictability. They moved in small groups through mock urban environments, communicating with hand signals and short verbal commands that often made no logical sense to the watching alien. When one group encountered simulated enemies, they responded with aggressive flanking maneuvers that ignored standard tactical doctrine. Instead of methodically suppressing enemy positions, they charged forward with covering fire and explosive devices. "Looks pretty wild, doesn't it?" Zektar turned to find Lieutenant Carter standing beside him on the platform. She held a cup of the dark liquid that humans consume to maintain alertness and seemed genuinely interested in his reaction to the training exercise. "Your soldiers appear to disregard established tactical principles," Zektar observed carefully, not wanting to offend his new allies. Lisa laughed, a sound that Zektar was beginning to recognize as expressing humor rather than derision. "That's because established tactical principles assume your enemy will behave logically. Humans don't always do what makes sense, and neither do our enemies." Below them, Captain Brooks shouted instructions to his Marines as they practiced breaching techniques on reinforced doors. They used explosive charges where Federation forces would employ precision cutting tools, creating much noise and destruction but achieving their objectives with surprising speed. "Captain Brooks has been training these guys for 2 years, Carter continued. He knows that when things go bad in real combat, training and instinct are all you have left. Our way might look messy, but it gets results." After the training exercise, Sergeant Amy Rodriguez invited Zektar to examine human weapons and equipment. The armory was smaller and less sophisticated than Federation standard, but the humans had organized it with impressive efficiency. Every weapon was clean and properly maintained despite their apparent simplicity. Amy picked up what she called an assault rifle and demonstrated its operation for Zektar. The weapon fired small metal projectiles using chemical propellants rather than energy beams or plasma charges. It seemed primitive compared to Federation technology, but Amy handled it with obvious expertise and affection. "This is an M27 infantry automatic rifle," she explained, breaking the weapon down into component parts with practiced ease. "It might not look like much compared to your fancy energy weapons, but it's reliable, easy to maintain, and it puts holes in whatever you point it at." Zektar examined the weapon carefully, noting its robust construction and simple operating principles. "What is its effective range and armor penetration capability?" Amy smiled and reassembled the rifle in seconds. "Depends on who's shooting it and what they're shooting at. In the right hands, this little beauty can reach out and touch someone at 800 meters. As for armor penetration, We've got special ammunition for different targets. She showed him various types of ammunition, from standard ball rounds to armor-piercing and explosive variants. Each type had been designed for specific tactical situations, and Zektar began to appreciate the flexibility that such a system provided. Federation weapons were more powerful, but they also required complex maintenance and energy sources that might not always be available in combat. During the afternoon meal period, Lieutenant Dan Phillips joined Zektar at one of the long tables in the mess hall. Phillips served as the unit medic and carried himself with the quiet confidence that marked good medical personnel across all species. He seemed genuinely curious about Catherian culture and asked thoughtful questions about Zektar homeworld. "We've been studying Federation medical techniques since first contact," Phillips said between bites of his meal. "Your trauma treatment methods are incredibly advanced compared to what we've been using." Zektar found himself explaining the regenerative healing technology that most Federation species took for granted. Phillips listened intently and asked detailed questions about application procedures and resource requirements. The human, obviously, possessed a sharp intellect despite his species' recent entry into galactic civilization. "On Earth, we've had to get creative with battlefield medicine," Phillips continued. "We don't have your fancy healing devices, so we've developed techniques for keeping people alive under pretty harsh conditions. Sometimes the old ways work just as well as high technology." As their conversation continued, Phillips began explaining human concepts that Zektar found difficult to understand. He spoke of brotherhood between soldiers and the importance of fighting for something larger than personal survival. These ideas seemed rooted in emotion rather than logic, which made them foreign to Catherian thinking. "You see, Commander, humans don't just fight because we're ordered to," Phillips said, his voice taking on a serious tone. "We fight for each other, for our families back home, for the idea that our sacrifice might make things better for the next generation. That's what makes us dangerous." Zektar considered these words carefully. In Catherian society, military service was a logical response to threats against the state. Soldiers fought efficiently and professionally because duty required it. The emotional motivations that Phillips described seemed unnecessarily complicated and potentially unreliable. That evening, Zektar attended what the humans called a planning session in Colonel Morrison's office. The room was decorated with images of previous military units and symbolic objects that held meaning for human warriors. Morrison and his senior staff reviewed the upcoming mission with professional competence that impressed the Catherian observer. However, Zektar noticed something in their discussions that he had not encountered before. The humans spoke of their objectives not just in tactical terms but in personal ones. They worried about civilian casualties and discussed ways to minimize collateral damage even at the cost of mission efficiency. They planned for the care of wounded enemies and the proper treatment of prisoners. These considerations went far beyond Federation military doctrine and seemed to add unnecessary complications to an already complex operation. Zektar wondered if such emotional thinking would prove to be a weakness when they finally faced the Vexani in actual combat. The transport ships descended through the thick atmosphere of Kepler 442b under cover of electronic jamming and stealth fields. Zektar checked his weapons one final time as the ship shuddered through atmospheric turbulence. Around him, the mixed Federation force prepared for their first combat operation against the Vexani forward base. The humans occupied one section of the transport bay, and Zektar noticed how differently they prepared for battle compared to other Federation species. While the Catherian warriors performed systematic equipment checks and reviewed tactical data, the humans engaged in what appeared to be ritualistic behavior. Some wrote on small pieces of paper that they tucked into their armor, others touched small metal objects hanging from chains around their necks. Private Scott Mason, who looked barely old enough to be away from his family, sat quietly sharpening a knife with methodical strokes. When Zektar asked about this activity, Scott explained that the blade had belonged to his grandfather, who had fought in wars on Earth. The young human carried it not because he expected to use it in combat, but because it connected him to his Family History of Military Service. It helps me remember why I'm here, Scott said simply, continuing to work the whetstone along the blade edge. The landing zone was a rocky plateau 5 kilometers from the Vexani installation. Federation intelligence had identified it as the optimal insertion point, far enough from enemy sensors to avoid detection, but close enough for a rapid assault. As the transport ships touched down, the joint force deployed with practiced efficiency. Colonel Morrison established his command post on a small rise overlooking the approach route to the target. Federation heavy assault units took positions along the main avenue of advance, while human Marines spread out to secure the flanks and provide reconnaissance. The operation proceeded exactly according to standard Federation doctrine. Zektar moved, with the Catherian assault formation as they advanced toward the first Vexani defensive positions. His tactical display showed enemy strong points exactly where intelligence had predicted them. The Vexani had constructed a series of overlapping defensive positions using their characteristic energy barriers and automated weapon systems. The initial contact came at exactly the range that Federation planning had anticipated. Vexani energy weapons reached out across the rocky terrain, their distinctive blue-white beams creating brief flowers of superheated rock where they struck. The Federation force responded with coordinated suppressive fire, while heavy weapons. Teams moved into position. This was the kind of warfare that Zektar understood completely. Both sides possessed advanced technology and trained soldiers who followed logical tactical principles. The battle developed according to established patterns of advance and counter-advance, with each side attempting to gain positional advantages through careful maneuvering. For nearly an hour, the engagement continued at this measured pace. Federation forces methodically reduced Vexani strongpoints while taking minimal casualties. Zektar began to think that the humans would serve adequately in their supporting role, providing security and logistics, while the more experienced Federation species handled the primary combat. Then everything changed with shocking suddenness. The Vexani had prepared a surprise that Federation intelligence had failed to detect. Hidden tunnels allowed them to deploy a strike force behind the advancing Federation units, cutting off their retreat and threatening to surround the entire assault force. Vexani warriors emerged from concealed positions and attacked with the desperate fury of soldiers fighting for their survival. Zektar found himself separated from his unit when a Vexani plasma mortar struck nearby, throwing him against a boulder and temporarily disrupting his tactical display. When his vision cleared, he saw Vexani soldiers advancing on his position with their energy weapons ready to fire. Private Scott Mason appeared beside him with his primitive chemical rifle, placing himself between Zektar and the approaching enemies. The young human fired controlled bursts that forced the Vexani to seek cover, buying precious seconds for the scattered Federation soldiers to reorganize. "Stay down, Commander," Scott shouted over the noise of battle. "I've got this covered." But the Vexani had more soldiers than Scott could handle alone. One of them armed what appeared to be a plasma grenade and prepared to throw it at their position. Zektar calculated that neither he nor Scott could reach cover before the weapon detonated. Without hesitation, Scott threw himself forward and covered the grenade with his own body. The explosion that followed was unlike anything Zektar had experienced in 3 centuries of military service. The raw sound of it seemed to tear through his consciousness. But worse was the sight of Scott Mason dying in front of him. The young human had traded his life for Zektar's survival without any calculation of personal benefit or tactical advantage. Zektar knelt beside the mortally wounded human, not knowing what to do or say. Scott looked up at him with eyes that were already growing dim and whispered, "Tell my family I did my duty." Before Zektar could respond, Scott was gone. The sound that rose from the human positions in response to Scott's death was unlike anything in Zektar military experience. It was not the disciplined war cry of professional soldiers or the calculated aggression of tactical doctrine. It was something primal and terrifying that seemed to come from the deepest part of human nature. Captain Brooks' voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "Mason down! All units advance and engage. Make them pay for every meter." What happened next challenged everything that Zektar thought he knew about warfare. The humans did not retreat to more defensible positions or call for supporting fire from Federation heavy weapons. Instead, they charged directly toward the Vexani positions with a ferocity that defied all logical military thinking. Zektar watched in fascination and growing horror as the Marines transformed from the friendly, laughing soldiers he had known into something entirely different. They moved with deadly purpose, using their primitive weapons with devastating effectiveness. Their battle cries echoed across the rocky terrain, carrying the names of their fallen comrade, the Vexani. Despite their superior technology and defensive positions began to fall back before this human assault. They had prepared for logical, methodical Federation tactics, but not for warriors who seemed to embody pure aggressive will. For the first time in his long military career, Zektar felt something that he had never experienced before. As he watched, the humans advanced through enemy fire with apparent disregard for their own safety. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the planet-cold atmosphere. It was fear, but not fear of the enemy. It was fear of his allies. The battle intensified as Federation forces pushed deeper into the Vexani defensive network. Zektar moved with the advancing human Marines, his tactical training warring with the new emotions that Scott Mason's sacrifice had awakened in him. Every time he looked at the humans around him, he saw not just soldiers, but individuals capable of the same devastating selflessness that had cost the young private his life. Corporal Kate Thompson led her squad through a maze of rocky outcroppings toward what intelligence identified as a critical Vexani communications hub. Zektar accompanied them as the designated Federation liaison, though he was beginning to understand that his real education was just beginning. Kate moved with confident precision, using hand signals to coordinate her team movements through the treacherous terrain. The Vexani had constructed their communications facility in a natural cave system, reinforcing the entrances with energy barriers and automated defense systems. Standard Federation doctrine would call for heavy bombardment to neutralize such a position, but the cave system extended deep underground and might contain valuable intelligence materials that bombardment would destroy. "We're going to have to do this the hard way," Kate announced to her squad. "Intel wants whatever data those caves contain, so we breach and clear room by room." Zektar observed the humans as they prepared for close-quarters combat in confined spaces. This was perhaps the most dangerous form of warfare, where superior technology meant less than training, courage, and split-second decision-making. The Marines checked their equipment with the same careful attention to detail that he had seen in the most elite Federation units. Private Nick Turner, who served as the squad demolitions expert, prepared breaching charges with steady hands despite the enemy fire impacting around their position. "Kate, I can punch through that barrier, but it's going to be loud and bright. Whatever's waiting inside will know we're coming." Kate nodded grimly. "That's fine, Nick. We'll go in fast and hard. Jerry, you and Mike take point. Commander Zektar, you stay close to me and watch how humans clear a cave." The breach went exactly as Kate had predicted. Turner explosive charge disabled the energy barrier in a flash of light and thunder that must have alerted every Vexani soldier in the complex. The Marines poured through the opening with their weapons ready, moving with practiced coordination through narrow tunnels carved from living rock. Zektar followed close behind Kate, marveling at how the humans adapted their tactics to the confined environment. They used their primitive projectile weapons to devastating effect in the close quarters, where Federation energy weapons might cause dangerous ricochets or cave-ins. Every corner was cleared methodically, every chamber secured before moving forward. The Vexani fought back with desperate determination, using their knowledge of the cave system to stage ambushes and fighting withdrawals. Their energy weapons created brilliant flashes in the darkness, temporarily blinding anyone not protected by tactical visors. The confined space amplified every sound until the battle became a nightmare of strobing light and deafening noise. It was in the deepest chamber of the complex that Zektar witnessed something that would haunt his dreams for cycles to come. Kate. Squad had become separated from the main force while pursuing fleeing Vexani soldiers. They found themselves surrounded in a large cavern with multiple exits, all of which the enemy had blocked with defensive positions. The tactical situation was hopeless by any logical analysis. The humans were outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped in an unfavorable position with limited ammunition. Standard Federation doctrine would call for negotiated surrender to preserve valuable personnel for prisoner exchange. Kate Thompson made a different choice. She activated her tactical communicator and spoke calmly to the Artillery Coordination Center. Fire mission. Grid reference 774 Alpha 9. Danger close. Repeat danger close. We are at ground zero. Zektar understood immediately what she was planning. Kate intended to call artillery fire on their own position, sacrificing her entire squad to eliminate the Vexani forces in the cave complex. It was tactically sound but personally devastating, and she delivered the coordinates with the same professional composure she might use to order supplies. "Kate, wait!" Zektar said urgently. "There must be another way. We can find an alternate exit or call for reinforcement." Kate looked at him with eyes that seemed far older than her years. "Commander, those Vexani soldiers in here are their communication specialists and intelligence officers. If they escape, they'll coordinate counterattacks that will cost hundreds of Federation lives. I won't let that happen." The artillery controller voice crackled through the communicator, requesting confirmation of the fire mission coordinates. Kate keyed her microphone and spoke her final words to the outside world. "Confirmed. Danger close fire mission. Tell my daughter Sarah that Mommy loves her very much. Fire for effect." The artillery strike arrived with the precision that marked Federation heavy weapons systems. The cave complex disappeared in a series of explosions that shook the entire mountain and sealed every tunnel permanently. Kate Thompson and her squad died instantly, along with every Vexani soldier in the complex. Zektar survived only because he had been standing near the chamber entrance when the strike began. The blast threw him clear of the cave system, though. He suffered severe injuries that would require extensive medical treatment. As he lay in the rubble outside the destroyed communications hub, he could hear other human voices calling his name. Lieutenant Dan Phillips found him first, applying emergency medical treatment with the efficient skill that marked good combat. Medics. "Easy there, Commander. You're pretty banged up, but you'll make it. Can you tell me what happened to Kate's squad?" Zektar tried to explain what he had witnessed, but the words seemed inadequate to describe the horror and majesty of Kate. Final act. How could he make Phillips understand that this human had chosen to die not from desperation or fear, but from a calculated decision that the mission was more important than her personal survival? As Phillips worked to stabilize his injuries, Zektar heard the distant sound of battle continuing elsewhere in the Vexani complex. The other human Marines were still fighting, still advancing despite the losses they had already suffered. They carried forward not just their weapons and equipment, but the memory of every comrade who had fallen. For the second time in a single day, Zektar felt the cold touch of fear that had nothing to do with enemy action. He was beginning to understand that humans possessed something that no other Federation species had ever developed, a willingness to embrace personal destruction in service of larger goals. This was not the logical sacrifice of assets to achieve tactical objectives that marked professional military thinking. This was something far more dangerous and powerful, a spiritual commitment that transformed individual humans into components of an unstoppable collective will. The fear that gripped Zektar was not fear of death or defeat. It was fear of the depth of human commitment and what they were capable of when driven by love for something greater than themselves. The final assault on the main Vexani stronghold began at dawn on the second day of fighting. Zektar observed from the field hospital where Lieutenant Phillips had brought him for treatment of his injuries from the cave collapse. His body was healing rapidly thanks to Federation medical technology, but his mind struggled to process what he had witnessed during the previous day of combat. Through the transparent walls of the medical facility, he could see the human Marines preparing for what everyone knew would be the most dangerous phase of the operation. The Vexani had retreated to their final defensive position, a massive fortress complex built into the side of a mountain. Intelligence reports indicated that they intended to make their last stand there rather than attempt evacuation. Major Chris Bennett had assumed command of the human ground forces after Captain Brooks was wounded in the fighting around the communications hub. Bennett was older than most of the other Marines, with gray hair and the weathered face of someone who had seen too many battles. He moved among his troops with quiet authority, checking on their preparation and offering words of encouragement. "How bad is it going to be?" Zektar asked Phillips as the medic changed the dressing on his arm wounds. Phillips paused in his work and looked toward the mountain fortress. "Bad enough. The Vexani have had time to prepare their defenses and they know we're coming. But Chris Bennett is good at this kind of fighting. He'll get our people through it." What Phillips did not say, but Zektar could read in his expression, was that many of those people would not survive the experience. The human medical officer had already treated dozens of casualties from the previous day fighting, and he knew that the final assault would produce many more. The attack began with a coordinated bombardment from Federation orbital platforms designed to suppress the heaviest Vexani defensive weapons. The mountain fortress disappeared behind clouds of smoke and debris as energy beams and kinetic projectiles struck with devastating precision. For nearly an hour, the bombardment continued with methodical thoroughness. When the firing stopped, Zektar expected to see the fortress reduced to rubble. Instead, the Vexani had constructed their defenses deep within the mountain itself, and most of their weapons remained operational. The bombardment had destroyed some outer positions, but left the core defensive network intact. Major Bennett's voice came through the tactical communication network with calm professionalism. "All units, the bombardment has been as effective as we can expect. We're going to have to finish this job the old-fashioned way. Remember your training, watch out for each other, and let's bring everyone home." The human assault began with small teams moving through the rocky terrain toward the fortress entrances. Unlike the previous day chaotic battle, this advance was methodical and coordinated, with each squad supporting the others as they closed with the enemy positions. Zektar watched through his tactical display as the Marines flowed around Vexani strongpoints like water flowing around stones. But the Vexani were determined to extract maximum casualties from their attackers. They had positioned their remaining weapons to create overlapping fields of fire that turned every approach into a deadly gauntlet. Human Marines began falling to enemy fire before they could reach effective range with their own weapons. It was then that Zektar witnessed the transformation that would remain with him for the rest of his life. The humans did not retreat or call for additional fire support when their advance stalled. Instead, they seemed to draw strength from their losses, becoming more determined rather than more cautious. Sergeant Amy Rodriguez led her squad in a flanking attack through terrain that should have been impossible to traverse under fire. They moved from cover to cover with desperate courage, using their intimate knowledge of small unit tactics to approach the fortress from an unexpected direction. When Rodriguez was wounded by Vexani energy fire, she continued to direct her team movements while applying pressure to her injuries. Private Jerry Walsh carried ammunition to forward positions, despite enemy fire that turned the ground around him into a moonscape of craters and melted rock. When his original load was exhausted, he went back for more, making trip after trip until other Marines had the supplies they needed to continue fighting. Corporal Mike Stevens used his squad automatic weapon to provide covering fire for advancing. Teams remaining in exposed positions long after tactical doctrine would have required him to displace. He stayed at his post until a Vexani plasma bolt finally found its mark, but by then the Marines he was supporting had reached their objectives. Through it all, Major Bennett moved among his troops like a force of nature, appearing wherever the fighting was heaviest to coordinate attacks and inspire his soldiers. He seemed to possess an supernatural ability to be exactly where he was needed most, whether that meant directing fire support or carrying wounded Marines to safety. What horrified Zektar was not the violence of the battle itself, but the way. The humans embraced that violence as a natural expression of their deepest values. They fought not just to destroy their enemies, but to protect something precious that existed beyond the battlefield. Every act of courage was motivated by love for their comrades and their distant families. When the fortress finally fell, it came not through superior firepower or tactical brilliance, but through the accumulated weight of human determination. The Vexani simply could not match the spiritual intensity that the Marines brought to their task. They fought well and died, bravely, but they were facing an enemy that had transformed warfare from a professional activity into a sacred ritual. The casualty count was devastating by Federation standards. Nearly half the human force had been killed or wounded during the two-day operation. Any other Federation species would have considered such losses unacceptable, even in victory. But the humans gathered their dead and wounded with the same fierce pride they had shown in battle. Lieutenant Lisa Carter found Zektar in the medical facility as the sun set on the second day. She bore fresh bandages on her left arm, and her uniform was torn and stained, but her eyes held the satisfaction of completed duty. "It's over, Commander," she said simply. "The Vexiani base is destroyed, and the threat to Federation supply lines has been eliminated." Zektar looked at this young human officer who had somehow survived the nightmare of the past 2 days. "At what cost, Lieutenant? Your people have suffered terrible losses." Carter was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the Marines who were establishing a perimeter around the captured fortress. "The cost is always terrible, Commander, but some things are worth any price. Freedom is one of them. The safety of innocent people is another. We fight so that others don't have to." As Zektar watched the humans honor their fallen comrades in a ceremony that combined military tradition with deeply personal grief, he finally began to understand the source of his fear. These beings possessed a capacity for sacrifice that went beyond anything in his experience, and that capacity made them the most dangerous warriors he had ever encountered. The journey back to Federation space gave Zektar time to process what he had experienced during the Kepler 442b operation. He spent long hours in the transport ship observation deck, staring out at the stars and trying to find words for the report he would have to file with Federation High Command. How could he explain the transformation he had witnessed, both in the humans and in himself? The surviving Marines occupied the same compartments they had used on the outbound journey, but everything had changed. They carried themselves differently now, marked by the shared experience of combat and loss. Some were quieter than before, while others seemed to need constant conversation to process their memories. All of them bore the invisible scars that came from watching friends die. Lieutenant Dan Phillips found Zektar during one of these solitary vigils and joined him at the viewing port. The human medic looked older than he had just days before, aged by the responsibility of treating wounds that no medical training could completely heal. "Rough trip," Phillips said quietly, settling into the seat beside Zektar. "Your people paid a terrible price for victory," Zektar replied. "I am still trying to understand why they were willing to sacrifice so much." Phillips was silent for a moment, considering his words carefully. "I don't think you can understand it by thinking about it, Commander. It's not something logical that you can analyze and categorize. It comes from somewhere deeper than that." "Where does it come from then?" "Love," Phillips said simply. "We fight because we love something more than we fear death. Scott Mason loved his family and his fellow Marines more than he feared that grenade. Kate Thompson loved her daughter and her mission more than she feared calling artillery on her own position. It's not complicated, but it is absolute." Zektar considered this explanation, comparing it to everything he thought he knew about military motivation. Catherian warriors fought from duty and professional pride, emotions that could be understood and predicted. But human love was something altogether different, a force that could drive individuals to acts that defied rational calculation. Does this make humans better warriors than other Federation species? Zektar asked. Phillips shook his head. Not better, just different. Your people fight with precision and intelligence, and those are valuable qualities. But humans fight with their whole souls, and sometimes that makes the difference between victory and defeat. When the transport reached Federation space, Zektar was summoned to present his operational report to the Strategic Assessment Council. He stood before a panel of senior officers from multiple species, all of whom wanted to understand how the newcomer humans had performed in their first joint operation. General Vorthok, a veteran Catherian commander who had mentored Zektar early, career led the questioning. Your preliminary reports suggest that human casualties were significantly higher than projected for this type of operation. Do you consider their tactical methods to be sound? Zektar chose his words carefully. General, human tactical methods are unlike anything in current Federation doctrine. They achieve objectives through means that appear inefficient by our standards, but their results cannot be questioned. Are you recommending that we modify our tactical doctrine to incorporate human methods? Asked Admiral Sekthara of the Velthari fleet. No, Admiral. I am recommending that we recognize human methods as a unique capability that complements existing Federation approaches. Humans do not fight the way we fight, and that may be their greatest strength. The questioning continued for hours, with the Council members trying to understand the implications of human military capabilities for Federation strategy. Zektar found himself struggling to convey the emotional and spiritual dimensions of human warfare to beings who approached military service from purely logical perspectives. Finally, General Vorthok asked the question that Zektar had been dreading. Commander, do you consider humans to be reliable allies for future operations? Zektar paused before answering, remembering Scott Mason throwing himself on the grenade, Kate Thompson calling artillery on her own position, and Major Bennett leading. His Marines through impossible terrain under devastating fire. General, humans are the most reliable allies I have ever served with. When they commit to a mission, they will complete it regardless of personal cost. When they accept you as a comrade, they will die before they abandon you. But they are also the most dangerous beings I have encountered, because their capacity for sacrifice has no apparent limits. The Council members exchanged glances at this assessment. General Vorthok leaned forward in his chair. Dangerous to their enemies, you mean? Dangerous to anyone who underestimates what they are capable of, Zektar replied, including their allies. In the weeks that followed, Zektar found himself repeatedly requested for assignments involving human units. His experience on Kepler 442b had made him one of the few Federation officers who understood how to work effectively with human military forces. Each operation taught him more about the depth of human commitment and the price they were willing to pay for their beliefs. He served with Marine units in the asteroid mining conflicts of the Rigel system, where humans fought in hard vacuum with equipment that would have terrified most Federation species. He participated in the rescue operations on Proxima Station, where human emergency response teams entered a radiation-flooded facility to save civilian workers from 12 different species. Through all these experiences, Zektar carried the memory of those first days of combat beside humans. He had learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite fear. He had discovered that love could be transformed into a weapon more powerful than any technology in the Federation arsenal. The report that Zektar finally submitted to Federation archives was classified at the highest level, but its conclusions eventually influenced military doctrine throughout known space. It established humans as a unique resource for operations requiring extreme commitment and sacrifice, while warning that their methods could not be easily replicated by other species. But for Zektar personally, the most important lesson was one that never appeared in any official document. He had learned that fighting beside humans was not just about witnessing their capacity for sacrifice, but about being changed by that witness. Every Federation officer who served with human units came away different, marked by exposure to a form of warfare that was as much spiritual as tactical. Years later, when young officers asked Zektar about his experiences with human military forces, he would tell them that fighting beside humans was the first time he truly understood both the glory and the terror of war. It was the first time he realized that some things were indeed worth dying for, and that the beings willing to make such sacrifices were the most dangerous and most precious allies in the galaxy.